Before we get to this week's episode, I want to tell you about a new podcast called Obscured. It's about critical issues that don't get much attention because they're complex, overshadowed, and happen largely out of the public eye. Like the right to intellectual freedom in prison, harm reduction, justice for the wrongly convicted, and the stories of law enforcement trauma survivors. Creators Emily Previty and Stephanie Marudis are seasoned journalists who are speaking with policy professionals, researchers, and other journalists to help people learn more about these underreported issues. It's produced by Kavunda Media, an independent, women-led production house. You can subscribe or follow Obscured wherever you get your podcasts.
From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State University, I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Candace Watt-Smith.
I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works. Our guest this week is Cas Mudde, who is a political scientist based at the University of Georgia, where he's the Stanley Wade Shelton UGAF Professor of International Affairs and a distinguished research professor. So, as you might guess, he's a fairly well-known scholar in his field, which is, broadly speaking, the study of populism and the far right. Cas recently visited Penn State to deliver the keynote address for the Populism, Piety, and Patriotism conference, which, Chris, you were instrumental in organizing and leading. And as part of that, he gave a keynote lecture on religion and populism. But for this interview, we talked about populism more broadly and why it seems to be ascendant in so many different places around the world right now. And that's really, I think if you take a step back and think about it, Chris, there are lots of places where, you know, these leaders that are all kind of a piece as far as their rhetoric and what they're pushing seem to be gaining rhetorical power and also political power.
And political power. That's right. And that's really why we want to do the conference, right? Because populism isn't, all that new, but it is striking how ascendant it is right now and also how widespread, right? You have people in very different countries, very different circumstances who are, and for that matter, different languages, cultures, and religions, all talking very similarly about, what the problem is and what I, the political leader, am going to do about it. And that is interesting and important and frankly, a little scary too. But so we decided to have this conference and, the first name that came up in terms of a keynote was Cas Mudde, because there's nobody. If you're going to write about populism, you just can't avoid him.
So the other part is not just what is it and why is it ascendant, but what it's not. I think that most people think about populist, and they think about particular characters, charismatic characters that seem to kind of bring out, in this case, like the kind of, I don't want to say the worst in people, but brings out a certain element that seems to be a similar element across contexts. And so in this way, I'm really glad that we brought him to kind of think about what are the patterns, what are the features, and that it's not just about personality. It's not just about charisma, and it's not just about strategy, but we can think more about this in terms of ideology. And so, with that, then we have kind of a more capacious way to understand it in a more nuanced way, too.
Right, and more precise, too, because you're right. I mean, there are people who talk about Vladimir Putin as being a populist, and that's just not accurate. So let's just talk about, what it is, in a sentence. Populism is the politics of the people against the corrupt elite. And both of those groups are defined. They're understood to be unified and have the same objectives. And, Cas says that the distinction between the two is fundamentally moral. So the people are understood to be decent, hardworking, to be committed to traditional values, and the elites are all corrupt, and they're looking to achieve power in order to pursue their own selfish, greedy ends. I think that's pretty pithy summation. Would you agree?
Yeah, right. So then if we kind of add on the ideology component of it, we think about political ideology as a system of beliefs, values, ideas that shape an individual's or group's kind of way of understanding of like who should get what, where power should lie, right? These have ramifications for policy. These have ramifications for what goals we should set, what the good life is, who should get what, and so on and so forth. So again, this kind of, this idea that we typically see it as like, hey, it's the good people against the bad elites. It's not just that, but it moves towards, policy ramifications about, material allocation of resources.
I mean, there, I think what Cas would say is that, yes, it's an ideology, but it's not merely an ideology. It is also a strategy. And that's kind of constitutive of politics generally, right? That you always have this kind of understanding of the way the world works and how the world should be. And then you use that to create a constituency and mobilize that constituency towards, political ends. The fact that in many cases, the policy agenda that follows when these people become ascendant, when these populist leaders become ascendant, isn't always populist. It isn't necessarily directed towards their well-being.
That's right.
It's often, and what we see now frequently, is people are using power to cement their own power, right? So, so they use their political standing to undermine minority rights, freedom of the press. This is something that you see repeatedly in when populist leaders like Modi in India and Orban in Hungary, you just kind of they have the power. They found this avenue to power, and I'm certain that just like any politician, yes, they believe it, but also they're going to frame it in a way that is more likely to be successful politically.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think we'll hear this from Cas, is that even then it's more complex because the examples that you're giving are right-wing examples.
Right.
And that there are also left examples of populism, and that looks different, right? And so one of the ways that he describes populism then is a thin-centered ideology that can be sutured with other kinds of frames, kinds of references. It could be nationalism, it could be chauvinism, it could be religion, it could be class.
And I think we'll also get to in the interview why this matters for democracy, particularly as it relates to liberal democracy and the tension between liberalism and populism. So lots of good stuff here. Let's get now to the interview. Cas Mudde, welcome to Democracy Works. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about populism and some of the things related to it, which has long been one of your areas of study. And I know in your work you break it down into three core concepts: the people, the elite, and the general will. So as a way of getting into it, I thought maybe we could take those one by one and talk about each of those elements and how they all come together to form a definition of populism. So let's start with the people.
So I think it's important that almost every definition of populism will have the struggle between the people and the elite in it. And I think what's important to note is that in my definition, the people are seen as homogeneous and the elite are seen as homogeneous, which means that the people are seen as sharing exactly the same values and interests. All people do, right? And similarly, all elite have that. And the second part is that the distinction between the people and the elite is moral. And so it's not about how much money you have. It's not about even whether you have a formal position of power. It is whether you're pure of heart or whether you're corrupt. And so the people, all people, are pure. And at the same time, all the elite are corrupt. And that is the main distinction between the two. And that is obviously a construction. Like, the people as such do not exist. And that is sometimes used as a criticism of, well, I mean, populism isn't real, but the nation doesn't exist. Class doesn't exist. All of the major collectivisms in politics are constructions, and the populists use the people versus the elite.
And have those conceptions of who the people are and who the elite are remained consistent over time, or do they change either from place to place or as you go throughout history?
I think both. Obviously, the people are always good, and there are some things that are universally seen as good, such as hardworking or truthful. And so you will find those everywhere. But at the same time, if you look at in time, initially the people were the farmers, because that was the bulk of, let's say, the non-elite. Now, of course, in many countries, farmers are only like 2-3% or something. And so later it became more the worker. And today, as we are in a society where kind of a vague middle class is the largest group, it is classless in a sense. And so you do see that over time, the people are constructed differently, but also cross-nationally, cross-regionally. And Ernesto Laclau, who is a famous scholar of populism, who has a very different understanding of it than me, has talked about the people as an empty vessel. And that is to a certain extent true, but not completely. Because if you want to be successful as a populist, you cannot describe the people in ways that do not resonate. So if you are here in the US, you want to be an important populist, you cannot describe the people as Muslim, right? You cannot describe them as nihilistic or whatever else there is that doesn't resonate with a large group of people. So populists always describe the people in line with generally a broader self-definition of it.
Right. So if we think about in the American context, it evokes, maybe images of patriotism or love of country, or this nostalgic idea of what the country what the country used to be, that has a lot of different things wrapped up in it.
Yes. And also what is important in the US, for some reason, although probably the largest group of Americans live in subcultures, in suburban settings. Suburban settings never feature, not in series, not in the self-definition of the people. And at the same time, the US traditionally has this kind of anti-urban, this fear of the city, this anti-urban sentiment. So the people here comes from the heartland, and the heartland is always rural. It's also white, but that's implicit to it, right? And so, whereas in the Netherlands, that will be different because it's a very urbanized country, and the rural part is kind of seen as the other part. So in that ways, it always reflects and stays close to self-understandings of the targeted group.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about the people, we've talked about the elite. What about this business of the general will?
So the general will has two elements. On the one hand, it again references this homogeneous understanding of the people. And the general will is a term used by Rousseau. in a very similar type of way, although, of course, much more nuanced and complex. But the idea is that the people have one will. But at the same time, by saying that they want politics to be in line with the general will of the people, there's also, at the most basic element, a democratic element to populism. And we're talking here about populism in theory. Mm-hmm. The fact that that doesn't always pan out in reality, we know from all kinds of ideologies, right? But the core of populism is that they claim to govern in line with the general will of the people.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you say that populism, again, in this theoretical framing, is neither good nor bad for democracy.
Yeah, if you keep democracy very limited, as I usually do, where democracy is popular sovereignty and majority rule, which means the people elect their leader by majority, then populism in theory is in line with that. However, if you see democracy broader, as we really normally do, which I call liberal democracy or constitutional democracy, then majority rules combined with minority rights, with separation of powers, things like that, rule of law. And there is an inherent tension with populism. And the reason is that liberal democracy is based on pluralism, on the idea that there are different groups in society that are all legitimate and they just try to find some kind of consensus among them. Monism, the idea that there's just one group, one legitimate group, is the essence of populism. So there's a fundamental tension between liberal democracy and populism, but not between populism and democracy.
Right. And I want to come back to that tension. But, you know, when populism is talked about in the media, it is often done in the same breath as things like authoritarianism and even fascism. And so I wonder if you could talk about those links, how they come about, and if this is, you know, how much is this just kind of the media throwing words around when the actual links might not be there in practice?
Yeah, I think there is a natural kind of alliance between populism and nationalism, in the sense that when you define the people on the basis of its self-image, you tend to come close to how the nation is defined on the self-image. That being said, not all populists are nationalists, and certainly not all nationalists are populists. Authoritarianism depends a little bit on how it is used. If you use it as anti-democracy, then as said, in theory, populism is democratic. If you use it more in a socio-psychological sense of a hang towards order and the idea that chaos is problematic and that the state should really enforce order, then that is a bit more of a natural ally, for the simple reason that the distinction between that homogeneous block of the people and a homogeneous block of the elite is normative. And that means that the other one is not a legitimate actor. Moreover, the elite is seen as corrupting our ways. And if that threat is so fundamental, then you might extend beyond your regular means of disciplining. Now, fascism is theoretically a purely elitist ideology. It doesn't just see hierarchy between races, but also within the German people. Hitler was not just like everyone. He was superior to every other German. Elitism is essential to fascism in whatever form. And as a consequence, fascism and populism are to a certain extent opposing views. That being said, fascism in the 1920s, 30s went through a so-called popular phase, where it did use some kind of what we could perhaps call populist rhetoric. But in essence, the system, both how it was run and justified, was much more elitist than populist.
Yeah. And it seems that, populism, at least in the past 8 to 10 years, has become ascendant and often aligned with the far right. So what is it about, kind of the far right ideology that aligns so well with what you've described as the populist ideology?
So I think that's a very important point. Both theoretically and historically, populism had left and right-wing variants in reality, and even at the turn of the century, there was significant left-wing populism, particularly in some Latin American countries. Today, and pretty much since 2016, Brexit and Trump, when we talk about populism, we actually talk about the far right. And that's why I'm less and less happy to talk about populism, because I think it has become increasingly used as a euphemism for the far right or for racism. Now, why is it mostly the right rather than the left at the moment that is populist? I think, first of all, within the more intellectual realm, as well as the official discourse, particularly within liberal democracies, it is relatively progressive. I'm not saying that countries are actually progressive in the way that they're governed, but the discourse tends to be. And that means that the left tends not to be fundamentally ousted. The far right, although actually in terms of its ideas not necessarily that far removed from how countries are being governed, are on the one hand treated by part of the establishment as outside of the realm, but also have created a kind of a self-victimization. And they see themselves as being marginalized by the establishment. And that is in the US even stronger than in other countries, but it has been around for a while. At the same time, what you see is the more the far right, particularly the radical right, is being mainstreamed, the less populist they are. And so a good example is the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, who are now supporting a minority government. About 10 years ago, they were strongly populist. The establishment went from left to right. But over the last couple of years, the right has embraced them. And so, of course, you're not going to pretty much bite the hand that's going to feed you. And so today, when they talk about the establishment, it's often the left. And you see that the more that the radical right is kind of embraced by at least the right wing of the establishment, populism goes down.
We had Francis Fukuyama here about a year ago, obviously one of the leading scholars on liberalism. And I think in his most recent book, he's kind of wrestling with this idea that liberalism will never be able to fully constrain populism or be able to constrain those kind of far right anti-democratic impulses. I guess I wonder what how you see those two and whether there is more that the institutions and things that comprise liberal democracy, could or should be doing to try to constrain populism in some way to prevent it from kind of veering into the anti-democratic space.
So I've described populism as an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. What I mean by that is that populism is illiberal democracy. I've argued that it is democratic, but it has problems with the liberal part of liberal democracy, right? And particularly minority rights, rule of law, separation of powers. Now, what do I mean with undemocratic liberalism? Particularly in the heydays of neoliberalism, the 80s and the 90s, what we saw was by and large a shrinking of the democratic space, mostly through privatization in the European context, also by pushing things up to the European Union. And all of that led to the situation in which a lot of policies are outside of the electoral realm. We cannot vote on public transport, for example, except for asking for the renationalization of public transport. But public transport is now a private business. And so it's not in the hands of the government, but that then also means it's not in the hands of the people. Now, that in itself is not undemocratic. And it's important, it's not just economic, but you can think about going further back, other liberal types of things, which is anti-discrimination laws or the banning of the death penalty. Now, I'm not taking a normative position here, but these are pretty far-reaching decisions, which in many countries were not shared by a majority of the people. They were put in a judicial realm or in an economic realm by people who were democratically elected. So pure in a formal sense, it was not undemocratic. However, in most cases, it was done without ever really making it part of the electoral process. And so if you get elected and then implement a policy you never talked about, and make sure that it's all done and dusted before the next election, that goes against the spirit of democracy. And so much of this pendulum swing towards more liberalism at the expense of democracy was done without fundamental debate. And this applies in the European context to European integration. Almost everywhere it applies to the issue of immigration, and you have all kind of other issues.
And so you talk about populism in terms of supply and demand, and one way to combat it perhaps, or to keep it in check, or reduce it in proportion to liberalism and liberal democracy, is to decrease the populist demand. So is addressing some of these economic issues, or kind of organizing in this class-based way, an example of that?
Yeah, partly. I argue that, and again, like for me, neoliberalism is not so much an economic system rather than a political ideology. And the thing that a couple of decades of neoliberalism has done is has depoliticized and de-ideologized politics. Because in neoliberal ideology, it's all about the market, right? And so politics is actually bad, stands in the way of efficiency. At the same time, ideology is denied in neoliberalism. It denies to be an ideology itself, and it argues that's all about rationality and pragmatism. Now, the consequence, as I've said before, is that more and more of pretty important aspects of our life, and I include public transport in that, for example, are put outside of the realm of politics. I think we need to take a lot of these things back. I think that the state should be responsible for things like public transport, for energy policy. And as a consequence, it shouldn't privatize these and have a grip on that so that people can decide on that. So that's one part. By repoliticizing, like you increase the reach of politics, and you get out of this TINA politics. There is no alternative, where people say, well, yes, this is a problem, but that's outside of our realm because it's globalization or the EU or the IMF, whatever. The second part is ideology. And my argument there is always like, if I give you $100, you will ask me, oh, why do you give that? If I say I want to, you will say thank you. If I ask $100 of you, you will still ask me, like, why? And if I say because I want it, you will not give it to me. Now, we're in a century of crises. Like with 9/11, we had the Great Recession, we had COVID, and now we have Ukraine, Russia. That means, together with all kind of other things, that people get less and less, either objectively or they get less than they expected. That means that you have to have a story. And the story cannot be pragmatism. It cannot be there is no alternative. You have to argue, explain to them, you have to give this up now, and this is your promised land, right? And that's what ideologies are about. It's about promised lands, and it's about values. And I believe that it's essential to do these two things together. And with that, it also means that we talk about different things. We have been talking about security, about identity, obsessively in most countries over the last decades, in part as a consequence of the fact that mainstream parties converged on neoliberal economics, and so they couldn't talk about that. But if you look actually at what people care about in many countries, and particularly younger people, and importantly, gender difference, women, for women, immigration and security are not top issues. Healthcare, education, housing is a major issue in many countries, right? If we talk about these issues, then the radical right, the populists, are less central. They don't disappear. They can give a populist spin on climate change. They can give a populist spin on housing, or a nativist spin on it. They can. But we shift the debate from them. We limit their agenda setting. And as long as we have a story, I think we can convince people.
So that leads me to one last question. This could easily take us into a whole separate conversation, which unfortunately we don't have time to have. But thinking about that COVID example in the American context, I started thinking about we had 6 weeks maybe of kind of national unity and we're all in this, and then states started going off and we got to reopen, and I think there was perhaps a populist element to some of that rhetoric from Ron DeSantis and others. And so that leads me to a question about, what if anything should media who are covering these populist figures do differently? Are they giving them too much attention so that a lot of the policies you were just talking about don't come to light? Are there other things about the way that this is all framed that make progress problematic?
Yeah, I'm going to upset some of your media listeners now, as well as some of my friends in the media, but I think particularly progressives should really stop looking at the media as an ally. The media is not part of the democratic structure. The media is part of the economic structure. The media is about making money, and they want to sell stuff. And so we can go on, and I've done this for decades, about how the media should cover this and that. But the media is going to cover things in the way that maximize their profit. That's the business model. And in the end, that's the only way they survive. Margins are small, so if they don't do it, they die. And I think that's the big problem. I mean, it's institutional. I know a lot of journalists. They would love to write different stories, but the editor tells them to write the next story about whatever outrageous thing Trump says. It is completely irrelevant what he says. He hasn't said or done anything in the last 3-4 years that fundamentally changes what we know about him. But these stories are read by us, the people, right? Whereas a really solid analysis of the housing situation is not read, right? And so we can look at the media, but I think we should look at ourselves. Like, we reward a structure, an infrastructure that benefits the populist. And that goes to the level of the newspaper I used to write for, The Guardian, which has a long history of what I call far-right porn, endless stories about irrelevant far-right with a big picture of a skinhead on it about they might be the next thing, right? But they only write it because the Guardian reader eats it up. They love to be afraid of the far right? And so why would we expect, this is to a certain extent saying to your dealer, you should stop giving me heroin. Why would the dealer stop? You should stop taking heroin.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a good place to end, a good reminder for all of us to resist those stories, as tempting as they may be. Cas Mudde, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Jenna, for that really great interview. There were so many things that were especially helpful for me. And one, I was thinking about, why is this a particular moment where populism is ascendant on the right, and why we may not have seen that in centuries past, especially in the United States. And I think Cas does a really good job of talking about these two elements. He talks about the elites, and then he talks about the people. And he talks about this idea about the people being pure and homogenous. And so that means that the people are a certain kind of people. It's not inclusive, it's actually exclusive. So let's say in William Jennings Bryan era or Andrew Jackson's era, we wouldn't expect a racial cleavage because Black folks and Native folks are not included in the polity. There's no need to exclude them. We can find some other elite, the people frame, whereas now race is very much a cleavage that folks can, that the people can center themselves around and be exclusive around.
So I do think that's a really interesting point because, there's, if you have an us, by definition, no, I think that's a really good and important point, and it kind of speaks to how populism is distinctive now, right? Because if you have an us, if you have a we, then you automatically have a they, you have a them, and who is the them, and in populism, it's always, an elite, but there's always somebody that's a threat. And, you're right that it wasn't racial for William Jennings Bryan and Huey Long or anybody else, Andrew Jackson, because African Americans and Native Americans weren't part of the polity, right? And then the moment that you had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the mid-'60s, boom, you have George Wallace, who was clearly a populist and was clearly seeing the us as, the good white people, the people of the heartland, whatever euphemism you want to use. But the thing that I was thinking about when you were talking is Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest in Detroit in the 1920s, and he was a raging anti-Semite.
So one of the things, just to piggyback off that Cas mentions up front, is that elites aren't always wealthy or politically powerful, right? So he makes it clear that, typically when we think about elites, we think about the powers that be, but he also kind of lays this out, right? So this is why anti-Semites can say that Jews are elite, or racists can say that Black folks are elite, or academics are elite, or like Black academics are elite, because ostensibly these are people who are influencing culture and influencing the way that, influencing our values or our way of life. And so in that way, on the one hand, right, you can see how that group can be used as a tool. On the other hand, you can see how this can kind of be delusional on some level, especially if the group that's the so-called elite is shifting culture. Culture does not often come with a similarly quick shift in, let's say, allocation of resources. So, like who's really being threatened, right? Who's really being threatened? Who's really losing out? But a populist can, especially, I think, the way that we see it now, that a populist can say that, your way of life is changing and that you're not able to, your kids are going to go to school and learn that they're racist, these kinds of things. When in fact, like, this has nothing to do with people's real material realities.
Well, the idea of democracy is simply majority rule, right? And if a populist is able to garner enough support, then they can basically do whatever they want within the context of democracy, right? But the reason you only hear liberal democracy is because a democracy without liberalism is a democracy that does not respect the rights of the minority. It does not respect the rule of law. It does not respect the procedures that are established to maintain those rights. So when you give, when you say, I am a beleaguered minority or a beleaguered majority being exploited by this elite, and we are the pure people and the other people are evil, then I think it's pretty easy to justify at minimum, restricting the rights of the minority, right? And Orban in Hungary, he says, I want to create an illiberal democracy. I want to give the power to the people, and I want to get rid of all these institutions that undermine their expression, their pure democratic expression. We've done, and what Cas's interview with Jenna shows is, A, this is an extremely important concept right now. B, it is on the one hand a little woolly, but it's also has some precision, and it allows us to see expressions of it all over the world right now. And so when I think anybody who listened to this podcast is going to say, oh, that's populism, and that's just what Cas said. And so you see it as, on the one hand, kind of a completely legitimate democratic expression, and on the other hand, extremely dangerous, right? Because once it's once you have an us, then you have a them, and it makes it very difficult to run a democracy that way, and especially when you think you are morally pure. So anyway, I think there's a lot to chew on here, and I really appreciate Cas coming to the conference and sitting down with Jenna.
For Democracy Works, I'm Candace Watt-Smith.
I'm Chris Beam. Thanks for listening.
Democracy Works is a collaboration between the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU, Central Pennsylvania's NPR station. Our editors are Mickey Klein, Chris Kugler, and Mark Stitzer. Editorial review by Emily Reddy, and additional production support from Andy Grant and Chris Allen. If you enjoyed what you heard today, leave us a rating or review in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. It will help new people find the show. Find more great podcasts about democracy and civic engagement in the Democracy Group Podcast Network at democracygroup.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.